Tonight, I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Caroline Lambert. Caroline started birding more than a decade ago when she lived in California. A love of photography turned into a love of photographing birds, which a lot of us can attest to. That's what happens, which in turn led to a deep dive into everything birds. Since retiring and moving to Alberta, she has spent much of her time involved in bird-related citizen science projects, such as Christmas bird counts and May species counts. She has several breeding bird survey routes and is heavily involved in the eagle migration count in Kananaskis as a principal observer. She spent much of the last year entering eagle count data into the hawk count database managed by Hawkwatch International, so that our local data can be integrated with other hawk counts across the continent. She also serves on the Alberta Birds Records Committee and hosts 3 of the provincial winter bird lists. Sounds like she's very busy. That said, over to you, Caroline, if you'd like to, there you go, share your screen.
Okay, thank you, Anne. So first a disclaimer, and that is, I'm not an expert on Moult. I'm far from it. I do know the basics, and I believe I can explain the fundamentals reasonably well. One of the reasons for taking on this assignment was, when I was asked if I could do it, was in part because I have a very good book on Moult. It's called Moult in North American Birds by Steve Howell, and I had never actually opened it. I have now read the introduction. Beyond the introduction, the book goes into specifics about species, and that's just way beyond the scope of this presentation. I want to emphasize the point that Moult is relatively straightforward if you understand the basics. But when you get down to the species level and the practical application of Moult, it becomes really complicated. As I was preparing for this presentation, there were a number of words that kept cropping up, such as sometimes, usually, not always, normally. There are exceptions, and quite often the statement that further research is needed. Even some of the species that we think are relatively common, more research is needed. I guess it's a difficult subject to study. Understanding about the plumage of birds can help identify them, not only to species, but to age them and determine gender. But in order to properly understand the plumage, it's useful to be able to understand Moult. In this presentation, I'll only have enough time to give you very basic information, but if you're interested in learning more, hopefully it'll give you a jumping off point to learning more, such as buying the book Moult in North America Birds by Steve Howell, and not just leaving it collecting dust on your shelf. So the bird in this photo, which is a California gull, is a good example of why birds have to molt their feathers. So this bird is, as far as I can tell, a first cycle bird, a first year bird, but it's getting towards the end of its first year, and its feathers are extremely worn. At some point, if it doesn't molt these feathers, it's just not going to be able to fly anymore. Feathers are absolutely essential for birds, for warmth, for decoration and flying, but they're not indestructible. They wear out and they have to be replaced. That process is called molt, and the result is a new plumage, which may or may not look different depending on a number of factors. To understand molt, first we need to lay some groundwork. We need to know the feather groups, at least some very basic feather groups. So I hope this is just a review for most people. On the wings, the feathers, the 10 feathers at the end are the primaries. Most species have 10 primaries, a few have 9. Most of the ones that we deal with have 10. And then they have varying numbers of secondaries. Secondaries that are closest to the body are called tertials. Then on either side of the back, you have the scapulars. And then the other important groups for molt are the primary coverts, which cover and protect the primary feathers, primary flight feathers. And then the greater coverts, which cover the secondaries, and the median coverts, which cover the greater coverts. When the wing is folded, it becomes a little more complicated. the back or the mantle, of course, is in the middle on either side of the back or the scapulars. And then we have the tertials are more evident when the wing is folded, and they serve to protect the secondaries, which are stacked below the tertials, and then the primaries are stacked below the secondaries. The primary coverts are really hard to see on a folded wing, but the greater coverts really stand out, and that's one of the reasons why they're fairly important on a perched bird. And then the median coverts cover the greater coverts. Wing bars, when they're present, are formed by the contrasting tips on the greater and or the median coverts. The wing bars on this bird have worn off. This sparrow, that photo was taken in July. It's just about to go through its summer molt, and so after it's molted, those wing bars will be more evident. All birds replace most of their feathers every year. Some birds don't replace all of them. The result of a molt is a new plumage, which may have or may not have a different look, and it may or may not be complete. A complete molt is when the bird replaces all of its feathers, the body, the wings, and the tail. And when a bird leaves the nest, it's in juvenile plumage. The process of acquiring that plumage is pre-juvenile molt. So this photo is a merlin that I found in Canmore last spring. It was a little anxious to get out of the nest, and you can still see the fluffy downy feathers that it had when it was in the nest. It's still undergoing its pre-juvenile molt, still growing them out. Okay, some species only molt once per year. A lot of our resident species like chickadees, jays, woodpeckers, corvids, ravens, crows, and many other bird families have only one plumage as adults, and it's called the basic plumage. The annual molt that results in this plumage is called the pre-basic molt. Molting is energetically expensive for a bird, so it never happens. Well, I won't say never happens, there are exceptions. Usually doesn't happen while they're breeding and doesn't happen while they're migrating, except there's exceptions there too. For our resident bird, or the species that molt once a year, it's a complete molt. So they molt all their feathers, including the wings, the body, and the tail. And I'm sure most people have seen blue jays and magpies that like to molt their head feathers all at the same time and have this resulting scarecrow look. The adult basic plumage is called the definitive basic plumage. And after that plumage has been attained, the appearance of the bird will not change very much, at least for these birds that molt once a year. Some species molt twice a year. So the yellow-rumped warbler starts out in this cryptic plumage, that when it becomes an adult, it switches between these two plumages. So the basic plumage on the left is winter plumage, non-breeding plumage, and it goes through what's called the pre-alternate molt to obtain the alternate plumage. That molt, the pre-alternate molt, is not complete. It's usually just the body feathers. So the appearance changes quite a lot. It is only just some of the body feathers that have been molted. So when it molts back into its basic plumage, and that's called the pre-basic molt, that is a complete molt. Okay, some species take a little bit longer to look like adults. A good example is the white-crowned sparrow. So the photo on the left is the white-crowned sparrow in its juvenile plumage. They do not stay in that plumage for very long. Sparrows, and especially birds that nest on the ground, need to leave their nest fairly quickly. So they grow these cryptic plumages fairly quickly. And because they're grown quickly, they're not very strong. If you have a bird that's hatched in June, it's not going to go through its pre-basic molt until the following summer, maybe July, August. So the feathers that it has, like if it were to keep those juvenile feathers all year long, they would have to last for 14 months, which is a long time. So they go through a another molt in the late summer, early fall into what's called a formative plumage. And generally we call those immatures rather than juveniles because they're not in their juvenile plumage anymore. And then when they become adults, then they obtain their adult plumage. Now, when referring to birds, most of the references that I read, they call an adult a bird that looks like an adult. It has nothing to do with sexual maturity. It just has to do with its plumage. If it looks like an adult, it's an adult. White-crowned sparrows actually molt twice a year. You wouldn't know that looking at them because they look pretty much the same all year long. You would have to go to some reference to find that out. And some of these juveniles are not streaked like the sparrows and the warblers, but they are spotted. I just threw this in because I think Townsend solitaires juveniles are pretty funky looking in their spotted plumage. You'll probably, most of the thrushes have some kind of spotty plumage when they're juveniles. I'm sure everybody's seen juvenile robins and maybe hermit thrushes or Swainson's thrushes. Okay, some species molt only once a year, but they change their appearance during the year. And so the classic example, which a lot of people know, is the European starling. It starts out as the juvenile with that very plain brown plumage. Adults and the juveniles actually molt into a plumage similar to the adult plumage. So by October, they're in this really resplendent, shiny, spotted plumage. As the year wears on, those spots wear off and they become darker and less spotted. I'm not going to talk about the bare parts too much in this presentation, but that is also something that changes throughout the year and can be helpful in identifying birds. So some people, I remember some post on Facebook recently or a few months ago where people didn't think it was a picture like the one, the October photo, because the bird didn't have a yellow bill. Well, it didn't have a yellow bill because starlings don't have yellow bills in the winter. Yeah, we don't normally see the very many starlings in the winter, so a lot of people wouldn't know that. A less classic example of a species that molts once a year, and I learned this by preparing for this presentation. I didn't know this before. I think it's very interesting. Snow buntings. In November, after the pre-basic molt, males and females look very similar, but the males actually actively abrade their feathers to obtain this black and white plumage through the breeding season. The females don't do that. The bird on the left is a non-breeding female. It's my photo, but the reason why I know that it's a non-breeding female is because it was chosen by the Cornell lab to illustrate in All About Birds, to illustrate the snow bunting species in All About Birds, also in Birds of the World. It's kind of fun when your photographs show up in All About Birds and Birds of the World. They don't tell you they're using them. You're uploading them to eBird, gives them license to do things like that. And it's actually kind of fun to run into your own photos when you, after you've uploaded them. So supplemental moults. I'm just throwing this in because we do have ptarmigans. You may encounter ptarmigans if you go hiking in the mountains. So some species have more than 2 molts a year. The third molt is called a supplemental molt, and it's usually incomplete. So the third one, the supplemental molt, will occur between the alternate plumage and before the basic. So sometime in the late summer and early fall. So if you see a ptarmigan in August, September, or whatever, and it's kind of got a splotchy white and brown plumage, I'm not sure how you would know what to call that without having a lot of expertise, because it could be its supplemental molt, it could be just molting into its supplemental molt, and it could be molting into its basic molt. So this photo, I'm pretty sure, is in basic plumage. Some exceptions. What's up with ducks? So they're confusing. Actually, they're more confusing than I thought when I read about this. They are, so the bright and easy to identify plumage, at least for the males, occurs in winter, which is different from, birds like the warblers and passerine species. And since the ducks are in this bright plumage for most of the year, this is what we call the basic plumage. The alternate plumage that occurs in the summer, at least for the male ducks, is called the eclipse plumage. So we have here a male mallard in basic plumage that was taken in March, and a male mallard in the eclipse plumage that was in July. And then the female mallard, I'm saying this is probably basic plumage because that was taken in November. So the males look a lot like the females. The best way to tell the mallards apart, the males and females, is the males have yellow bills and the females have orange ones. Other odd things about ducks is they molt their flight feathers all at once and are flightless for a few weeks. And this includes both the males and the females. Females go through their pre-alternate molt before males, and they can do it sometimes before breeding or even during breeding. So I guess the idea is that if you're sitting on a nest or you're caring for young that can't fly, you might as well, shed all your flight feathers and not fly as well. The males have a little bit of a different behavior. They go through their pre-alternate molt after breeding, so June and July. And they're really hard to find, in part because their eclipse plumage is very often similar to the female plumage, and partly because many of them go somewhere else to molt. So some ringneck ducks have been known to fly 1,000 kilometers north to go their molt. They find a quiet lake and hide in the reeds and are difficult to find. I've given mallards as an example, but there are, as in everything, exceptions. I think golden eyes molt later in the summer. Anyway, so on the left here, we have what we know to be a female. Most male ducks take a year to reach their adult plumage, and a few take 2 years. The few that take 2 years are mostly sea ducks and things like long-tailed ducks. But for most ducks, they take a year to reach their adult plumage. So on the left, we have what we know is a female bufflehead because she's with the young. The young could be either gender. And on the right, we have a male who's just beginning to acquire that white patch on the head is expanding, and so it's just beginning its molt into a more familiar plumage. But in the middle, we have a duck that it could be a female, but unless you are extremely experienced, you wouldn't be able to tell that this could also be a male. I believe the differences are very subtle. For buffleheads, I think it has something to do with the amount of white in their wings. So a lot of people, rather than calling the one in the middle a female, they might call it a female type, because without a lot of practice, you may not be able to tell whether that's a female or a juvenile male. The terminology can be pretty confusing. There's this basic alternate terminology that I just talked about. A lot of people use breeding and non-breeding, or summer or winter, and I've used that as I've gone through this presentation. There's another system that uses the calendar year. Over in Europe, they have something that's called the life cycle. So the life cycle is actually fairly intuitive, where they talk about post-juvenile plumage or summer plumage, winter plumage, and then breeding and non-breeding for adults. First summer, first winter for the younger birds, second summer, second winter for birds that take longer to grow up. So it's relatively straightforward, but it doesn't cover. The life cycle system is mostly for mid-latitude birds in Europe. So it was developed around those birds. The basic alternate terminology is, it keeps changing, but hopefully this basic alternate terminology will settle down. At the moment, there's a book called The Identification Guide to North American Birds that bird banders use, and it's written by Peter Pyle. And Peter Pyle's current project is to go through all these species accounts in the Birds of the World collection and change all the terminology so that it fits this current terminology. So in the current terminology, you just need to know 4 words: juvenile, formative, basic, and alternate. Sometimes you'll run across the word juvenile instead of juvenile. Those are synonymous, and juvenile only applies to plumage, doesn't, whereas juvenile plumage, the word juvenile can also apply to the bird itself. Juvenile plumage is equivalent to its first basic plumage. Formative plumage, and I showed you that example of the white-crowned sparrow, is any plumage that's found in the first cycle or the first year, but lacks a counterpart in subsequent cycles. It acts as a bridge between the juvenile plumage and the entry into the second cycle. And Steve Howell, I think this quote from him is very appropriate, because we're trying to make this elegant human system, but it's always an imperfect attempt to put dynamic natural sort processes into boxes, and there will always be exceptions. So going back to this slide, even though that bird in the middle might look like an adult, when I don't know for sure, it could be a juvenile. So when the juvenile goes into that plumage, that's the preformative molt, similar to the white-crowned sparrow. This terminology using juvenile, formative, basic, alternate is called the modified HP system. It was originally proposed by Humphrey Parkes in 1959 and was modified by Steve Howell in 2003. So that terminology allows for comparison of plumages and molts regardless of the breeding season, where you are in the world, or age. And the biggest problem that I can see is the uptake of the system is slow. So older papers and articles may refer to the system that was in place before the HP system. If you have a subscription to the Birds of the World, which for the value it gives me, I think it's highly worthwhile. The white-crowned sparrow section was last revised in 1995 and refers to basic 1 instead of formative plumage. And the Harris's sparrow was last updated in 2016, uses new terminology. So it's confusing because the old terminology is still out there. But over time, presumably that will go away. And then there's the banding terminology. And I'm throwing this in there because you'll often see the alpha code on the left and wonder what it is. U is for unknown, HY is for hatch year. So that's a term that's given to a bird that is known to have hatched during the calendar year in which it was banded. So this is one of the problems with the banding terminology, is it goes by calendar year. And so it works in the Northern Hemisphere, but if you were in the Southern Hemisphere and you had a raptor that laid 2 eggs and one of them hatched on December 31st and the second one hatched on January the 1st, according to this terminology, they would be in different years. The first one would be a second year bird, and the first one would be the second one would be a hatch year bird. So if they have a bird and they don't know if it hatched in the previous year, or they know that it did not hatch in the previous year, then it's called an after hatch year bird, unless they now have more information about it. If they can determine that the bird hatched in the previous year, then it becomes a second year bird, and so on. Timing of molt. The timing of molt is very variable. It varies between species, within species, and it can be different within an individual from year to year. You just have to go and look at a whole bunch of gulls, and you'll find them in all kinds of different, well, not the gulls that we get in Calgary in the summer, because they're mostly adults. But if you were, say, on the West Coast and in the winter, you would have a whole bunch of birds that all look different. They may all be the same age, but they all molt at different speeds. A lot depends on how well they're doing. If they have a lot of food, they can molt fairly quickly. If they don't have enough food, the molt goes slowly. And then some species Some migratory species will molt on the breeding grounds after breeding, some on their wintering grounds after migrating, and some start their molt before migrating, stop molting while they're flying. They may have a stopover place where they continue the molt and then they keep flying again. A lot depends on the distance that they have to travel as to whether, like, the short distance migrants might molt after they've migrated. Longer distance migrants are more likely to molt before they leave, I think. Knowing the timing of the molt, and this is something that takes a lot of expertise, can help distinguish between, for example, pairs of similar shorebirds, such as Western and semi-palmated sandpiper, greater and lesser yellowlegs, the American and Pacific golden plovers, even dowitchers. That's not something I can do. It takes some practice. So Moult limits. This is another term that comes up occasionally. It's used. Moult limits are used to age birds. So old feathers appear faded. They are paler. They have frayed edges, nicked edges. They've lost any pale edgings. And new feathers are darker, crisper, and have clearer markings. And any pale edgings are more obvious. And so you can see with these two birds on the right, one is pretty worn out, and the other one is got some spanking brand new plumage and looks very neat. So a molt limit is the location between feather tracks where feathers of two different generations appear side by side. So in North American passerines, molt limits occur primarily in, so using the banding terminology, hatch year and second year birds, and represent the contrast between retained juvenile feathers, because they don't molt their feathers, they don't have, not all their molts are complete molts. And so this can be used to age young birds, but not adults. So here we have an example of a molt limit. It took a while to find a photo that was not horribly confusing. Ignore the fine print on the right. But the thing to look at here is the primary coverts are juvenile. So those are retained juvenile feathers. They're pale, they're narrow and have no edging. Quite often juvenile feathers are narrow and more pointed than adult feathers. And then when you look at the greater coverts, you can see the inner greater coverts, the ones next to the body, are fresh. They're black, they're dark, they have white tips, whereas the outer greater coverts are darker brown, they're worn, and they have a narrow edge, a narrow buff around the edges. With experience, you can, an experienced person would know that you have three generations of feathers here. We have the juvenile feathers, we have formative feathers, and then the dark feathers with the white tips are first alternate. The birds always, so adults go through basic alternate, and the birds start that, go through alternate basic right after their formative plumage. So the first plumage that they molt into, so a bird like this yellow rump warbler, after its formative plumage, it will molt into its first alternate plumage, and then later in the summer it'll molt into its first basic plumage, or that'll be the second basic plumage. Knowing that this bird has three generations of feathers, and knowing that the bird was photographed in April, they can call this, they know that this is a second year bird. And when they say second year bird, that is a second calendar year bird. So this is one of the reasons why molt is so confusing, because, or the terminology is confusing, because it is a bird in its first year of life still. But it, as a bird bander, you'd call it a second year bird. But this is how they use molt limits to determine age. So anybody who's done any banding would be familiar with that. Molt is symmetrical. So on the left, we have a ferruginous hawk with some feather damage. We know it's feather damage because what's happening on the left side of the wing is not happening on the right side of the wing, and vice versa. But if you look at the broad-winged hawk on the right, you can see that the secondaries have dusky tips and the primaries have dark tips, but the wings look the same on both sides. And if you count inwards from the outside of the wing feathers, so the outer primary will be the 10th primary, and then the 9th, and then the 8th, and then the 7th. And then there's actually a bit of a gap next to the 7th primary, and that occurs on both sides. It's a little more obvious on the upper wing, where you have that bright spot just below the 7th, what's called P7, so P10, P9, P8, P7. So that's a feather that's growing in, and it's growing in at the same time on both sides of the wing. And then the secondaries, what I found interesting about this bird after studying it is it doesn't have enough secondaries. Broad-winged hawks have 13 or 14 secondaries, and I cannot see 13 or 14 here. So they molt feathers basically one at a time. Well, here we've got a secondary and a primary molting in at the same time. So you can see the little bright dot in the middle of the secondaries, at the base of the secondaries. That's probably a gap due to another secondary coming in. But because it doesn't molt adjacent feathers at the same time, it can spread out its feathers to cover any gaps because of one missing feather. If you had 2 or 3 missing feathers, it's harder to cover up that gap. So that's a reason why this broad-winged hawk doesn't look like it has 13 or 14 secondaries. It's lost at least 1, if not probably 2. They molt their feathers in waves. All right, so now we're going to go to, I'm sure what everybody's been waiting for is this short discussion on gulls. So what's the deal with gulls? The first thing you need to know about gulls is that some are 2-year, so which means that they attain their adult plumage in their 2nd year. Some are 3-year and some are 4-year. So the local examples of these are the Bonaparte's gulls, ring-billed gulls, and California gulls, and I've shown them here in their basic and their alternate plumages. So in the winter, California gulls have that streaked head. Their bills tend to be more subdued yellow. Their legs are kind of a greenish yellow. If you could see the legs of the bird in the alternate plumage, they would be bright yellow. Ring-billed gulls also have a little bit of streakiness to their heads in winter. That's common amongst the white-headed gulls. We give the ages of gulls as cycles. We refer to them as first cycle, second cycle, third cycle. So one of the reasons for that is that, for example, California gulls, they go through both a pre-basic molt and a pre-alternate molt every year. It takes them 4 years to grow up. The pre-basic molt can last a long time. It can last more than 6 months sometimes. So it can actually start a pre-alternate molt while it's still undergoing its pre-basic molt. And this is one of the reasons why gulls are so confusing, is that they could be just molting all the time. A cycle is defined as going from one pre-basic molt to the next pre-basic molt, which is usually a year, but it could vary. So here we have first cycle Bonaparte's gulls. They will gradually lose those pretty feathers on their wings and turn all gray. And the ring-billed gulls, first cycle has that kind of mottled brown look. And then the second cycle, actually the last cycle before gulls become adults, they look a lot like adults, but not quite. Most adults most immature gulls in their last cycle before becoming adults tend to, they lack the white tips on the primaries. The tips of the primaries tend to be much darker than the adult version, but their mantles are mostly gray. The wings are mostly gray. They may have some blacks on their tails. So if you look at this first cycle California gull, It's not a juvenile anymore. It has lost juveniles have black bills. Their heads are all brown. So it has already started some molt. If you could see more closely, you would notice that there are some gray feathers coming in on the mantle. So a lot of first cycle gulls will look similar to that. The second cycle gull, this photo was taken in May, so there's actually about 20 months between those two birds. But we can see that the mantle is mostly gray. There's some gray coming in on the wings, and the upper tail is white. It's lost that speckled look of the juvenile. So a lot of second cycle gulls of different species look somewhat like this, with where the mantle looks more like an adult and the wings look more like the juvenile. And then in the third cycle for the California gull, you can see that this gull hasn't acquired those white tips on the primaries. It actually has a little bit of black on the tail, and it hasn't developed the gray linings of the secondaries and the primaries on California gulls have this dusky gray color, which is actually a useful way to distinguish them from other gulls when they're flying around. The main point I want to make here is that one of the reasons why gulls are so confusing is that they are continuously molting. Molts take a long time. So another favorite species is eagles. They take even longer to become adults. So the one on the right is a 4 or 5 year bird. It's not easy to tell from the photo because they take different lengths of time to attain that plumage. Not all of these are my photos, so I've labeled them the ones that I stole from other places. We all know the juvenile plumage. It's dark brown, easily confused with the golden eagle for people who don't know where the white should be on the wing. The bill is gray. And then when it gets into the second year, and this is true for a lot of raptors, maybe all raptors, juvenile feathers, flight feathers, both in the wings and the tail, are longer than the adult feathers. So you can tell that this bird has undergone at least one molt because it's got all of these retained primary feathers that look longer than what you'd call adult feathers. It may not have those feathers when it becomes an adult, but so adult length feathers. It's fairly easy to distinguish a second year bald eagle because they have a lot of white on them. The bills are just beginning to turn yellow at the base, and the heads are beginning to turn white. At the eagle count, we call these white belly 1. So that's a term that you might run across sometimes. When they come into their third year, so the reason why I borrowed this photo, I have a perfectly good photo of a third year eagle, but the one that I have doesn't have this retained juvenile feather. So it's got one juvenile feather on each side. The one on the top wing has faded and mostly worn away. And the one on the bottom is quite obvious. So that's one way of knowing that it's a third year bird, because a second year bird would have a lot more of those retained juvenile feathers. And they gradually lose all their the white feathers and become, at least on the body, they get more white feathers on the head and the tail. That's just a general guideline of aging bald eagles. Sequence of molt in a wing. Ducks lose all their flight feathers all at once. So this is not a particularly good example, I realize, of showing how birds molt their feathers. Generally, they molt them from the inner primary to the outer primary, and from the outer secondary to the inner secondary, and then from the tertials inwards, and the tertials outwards, sorry. Wing molt in large birds, however, gets more complicated. This is just a generalized view of a medium-sized raptor. And what this shows is that the molt happens in waves. In this diagram, the black feathers are the most recently molted feathers. And then the gray feathers are the feathers that were molted in the previous molt cycle. And the white ones are the retained juvenile feathers. So you can see that it's doing this molt in in waves. It could be molting several primaries and a couple of primaries and a couple of secondaries at the same time. And it does it in these waves so that it doesn't have large gaps in the wing, as we saw in that broad-winged hawk, which was definitely molting some of its feathers, but it didn't look like it had a lot of gap. It didn't look like it was missing feathers. And then just wrapping up here, I watched recently a YouTube video of Peter Pyle giving a presentation on molt. And at the end of the presentation, he said that researchers are increasingly turning to the Macaulay Library for getting photos of birds in molt. And his complaint was that most people, when they take are reluctant to upload their shabby, ugly looking photos and tend to upload all of these beautiful birds in their alternate plumage. Like his example was broad-billed hummingbirds. He said 75% of the photos of broad-billed hummingbirds uploaded through eBird to the Macaulay Library are males in their alternate plumage. And he was pleading for people to please upload some of your less spectacular looking birds or photos of birds. This is a common loon in its alternate plumage on the left, and then one that's going through its pre-alternate molt on the right. I think if Canadians knew what common loons looked like in the winter, they would not be quite so keen to have them as a national symbol. That photo was taken in California. So here's other examples of birds that have undergoing molt. They particularly like open wing shots. I'm not sure what the open wing shot of that avocet is saying, but I'm not an expert, so it might be useful to some researcher. This song sparrow on the right, now that I'm looking at it, is actually really interesting because its tail is really frayed and it has lost all of its, or nearly all of its, greater coverts, which somebody might find interesting. Okay, I think that brings us to the end. And so I'm happy to entertain questions, although since I'm not an expert, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer them. But please ask questions if you have them.
What was the name of the book you mentioned? The Moult book, I think that you mentioned. Yeah, maybe show.
Or if you can see this, it's kind of always hard to.
Oops, there it is.
I put it right in front of my face. Molt in North American Birds by Steve Howell.
Okay.
I have to say, if you do get interested in molt, you really have to get, a subscription to Birds of the World, which has every single species account, has a section on molts and plumages. Your field guide is not going to do it for you. They don't mention molt at all, at least the ones that I have. And then I have a whole bunch of books that specialize in various bird families, and the Warble Guide, I think, does not talk about molt, but this Peterson reference guide, Gulls of the Americas, that goes into molt a bit. And then I have a shorebird guide, and that also goes into molt. My sparrow guide, I'm very disappointed in my sparrow guide. It does not talk about molt. But just
interesting. Yeah. Well, I thank you very much. I'm sure that was a very difficult presentation to put together, and thank you for doing that for us.
Annie has brought up something very important. So full access to Birds of the World is available through the Calgary Public Library, and library cards are free for Calgary residents, and that's possibly true for other municipalities as well. So thanks, Annie, for bringing that up. I think Annie's told me that before and I forgot.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, and much appreciated you doing that talk for us. It was one that was requested by, I don't know, somebody about a year, 2 years, 3 years maybe ago, and it took a while to find somebody who could do it. And so great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.